Let's give our praises to the Most High, whose true name in Hebrew is Yahweh, in the name of his only begotten Son, whose true name in ancient Hebrew is Yahweh Shai, and the Holy Spirit, which in ancient Hebrew is the Rakak Kodash. Double honors to the elders and apostles by the Holy Spirit who taught us his truth. Honors to the brothers risking their life and freedom to push the gospel. Peace and blessings to the elect, which would be the so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, and Seminole Indians, who make up the lost 12 tribes of Israel, according to scripture and according to prophecy. But the elect would be 1/3 of the Israelites who will return back to the Most High during the last days, which is right now, to receive salvation, while the 2/3 of Israel who don't turn back to the Most High be destroyed in judgment. We back with another lesson through the mercy, Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shah. This is going to be Remember the Help from Heaven, number 33. And it's going to be titled Transfigured Before Them. It's going to be titled Transfigured Before Them. So we're going to start here, Romans 15:4. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. So the things written in the past, recorded in this book, was written for our learning in the future, which is right now, here at the end. So the Lord told us back then the things we would face here at the end. And then the Lord gave many examples of how he can and will deliver us here at the end from all our troubles. And we are to have faith in those miracles. And for the sake of this lesson here, a miracle that Yahweh Shai performed, he was transfigured. Now we're going to look that up, what it means. And that's one of the miracles that the Lord going to perform for us here at the end. Certain brothers and sisters, they're going to be transfigured before their enemies, to be delivered from whatever trouble they need to be delivered from. So again, the Lord, told us the troubles that we're going to face, but he told us and gave us many examples of how he will deliver us out of those troubles: the sword, the famine, the pestilence, and then ultimately the second death, which is the nuclear destruction. But we're going to start here now with the book of Luke, chapter 4, verse 28. And we're going to go straight to the point. Pretty much, Yahweh Shai was schooling the people and pretty much getting on them for their lack of faith. And they got upset with them. And all day in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath. That's no different today. That's all the scriptures say. Do I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? It says, and rose up and thrust him out of the city. People be ready to lay hands on us. It says, and led him unto the brow of the hill whereon their city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. And when you read this in the NLT, it pretty much says they wanted to throw him over the cliff. Throw him, down the mountain head first. But it say this, but he passing through the midst of them went his way. Again, he passing through the midst of them went his way. Now, one may read this and think Yahweh Shai just ducked and dodged everybody. But you got to consider that Yahweh Shai probably transfigured right here. Probably turned invisible or transfigured into a spiritual body. A body that could be seen but not be touched by humans. But again, he says, but he passing through the midst of them went his way. And he came down to Capernaum, city of Galilee, and taught them on the Sabbath days. But again, the focus, he passed through the midst of the people. And when you consider the works of Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai, you have to consider that he was transfigured. Now, we're going to also go here to the book of Mark chapter 9, verse 2. After 6 days, Yahushua taketh with him Peter and James and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. Now we gonna look at that word transfigured, and let's start there real quick. Let's look up this word transfigured. We're gonna look this up in Greek. So transfigured, G3339. Sort of where they get the English word metamorphosis from. So let's click G3339. Let's go here. And to transfigure, it says to change into another form, to transform, to transfigure. Matter of fact, I missed the point. He was transfigured before them. Now, how did he transfigure or transform or change to another form? It says his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can white them. So he started, glowing pretty much. That was some transfiguring. Now, again, back to this word transfigure, it says to transform, to transfigure, to change it to another form. Now, let's look up this word transfigure. Now, over here to the right, I got a screenshot from my phone, which is the same thing as we can see. Transfigure, it says transform into something more beautiful or elevated. So when Yahushua transfigured, he transforms into his higher self. He transfigured into a spiritual body, a celestial body. Elevated meaning it's above the flesh. That's that spiritual body. That's what he transfigured or transformed into. And again, that's why it says, and he was transfigured before them, and his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow. So he had a glow about him. He was glowing. He was shining. He was no longer confined or restricted to a physical, fleshly body. And when we come back to the book of Luke, chapter 4, verse 29, we'll start there. Start at 28. They were in the synagogue, were filled with wrath, rose up to thrust them out of the city, led him to the brow of the hill whereon their city was built, that might cast him down headlong, throw him over the mountain head first. It says, but he passing through the midst of them went his way. So you can assume that he transfigured. Now, when he transfigured, again, you're not limited or confined, restricted to a mortal, fleshly, physical body. So although when Yahushua transfigured in the book of Mark, before Peter, James, and John, it said he started glowing. Well, here he chose to glow. But when you go back to Luke 4:30, when it says, but he passing through the midst of them went his way, he probably just made himself invisible. Because the spiritual bodies, they can do that. They can change their appearance. A spiritual body can choose to be seen, like here in the book of Mark with James, John, and Peter. A spiritual body can choose to be seen. It can choose to glow, or it could just choose to remain invisible. But that's why it says, but he passing through the midst of them went his way. He turned invisible on them. And even when you look this passage up on Google, even Esau's wisdom and the scholars of this world, they speculate that he turned invisible. And it will only make sense seeing that throughout the scriptures, Yahweh Shai, transfigured or changed his form before men. But again, transfigure, it means to transform into something more beautiful. And what's more beautiful than these terrestrial, earthly bodies? The celestial, heavenly bodies. Elevated, and that would be the spiritual bodies, his higher self. So now we're going to look up another word. So when we come back to this word transfigure, it says to transform, to transfigure. That could be used interchangeably, but also to change it to another form. Now this word is heavy when we look at it. Now let's look at this. So form, the visible shape or configuration of something. The body shape of a person or animal. Now let's come to definition number 2. It says a particular way in which a thing exists or appears, a manifestation. So when Yahweh Shai changed it to another form, he changed the way that he existed. He changed the way that he will appear in the earth. He changed his manifestation. Now, back to Mark 9:2, at the bottom, it says that he was transfigured before them. It says, and his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow. So Yahweh Shai changed the way he appeared before Peter, James, and John. So previously he appeared to them in the flesh. He was manifested unto them in the flesh. But then he transfigured or changed his form, and he manifested before them in that spiritual body. He manifested before them, and he had a glow about him. And then when you go back to Luke 4 and 28, when it says they were filled with wrath, or 29, it tells you that they rushed him and wanted to throw him over the cliff. Verse 30 tells you he passing through the midst of them. So even here, previously when they rushed him, he appeared or manifested in the physical body, a terrestrial, fleshly body. But as he passed through the midst of them, he transfigured or changed his form. And he no longer appeared to them, but he manifested before them in an extraterrestrial, a spiritual body, and turned invisible. He chose to not be seen. So he chose to not appear in a way that normal humans can see him. Now, when we come back to the book of Mark 9, we're going to get 2 again, and we're going to continue because something pops up. And this is going to prove that Yahweh Shai's transfiguration, that he changed into a celestial, extraterrestrial, spiritual body. After 6 days, Yahweh Shai taketh with him Peter, James, and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. Then when you look up transfigured, he transformed, he changed into another form. He changed into another way to manifest before them. Goes on to say, his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow. So he started to glow. So as no fuller on earth can white them. But this is the point here. It says, and there appeared unto them Elijah and Moses. And they were talking with Yahweh Shai. Elijah and Moses was not physically there. Not in an earthly, terrestrial, fleshly body. But they did exist. They did appear in a spiritual body. So they manifested in a heavenly, spiritual, extraterrestrial form. Because Elijah and Moses was long dead, in the flesh. But their heavenly, terrestrial, spiritual selves manifested in the earth. And here, Peter, James, and John, they could see Elijah and Moses, but they couldn't touch them. Because in the physical sense, he wasn't there. They wasn't there. But spiritually, they were. And that's the same when Yahweh Shai, but he passing through the midst of them with his way. He chose to be invisible, but Yahweh Shai could have chose to be visible. And even if he would have been visible, the people wouldn't have been able to touch him because he had transfigured here too, from a fleshly body into a spiritual celestial body. You can see it or you could not see it, but you can't touch it because those bodies are not limited to the laws of physics that the fleshly bodies are restricted to. So Elijah, Moses, and Yahweh Shai, who the world called Jesus, when they manifested in their spiritual forms, they were alike. But keep in mind, it tells you that Elijah and Moses appeared. Elijah and Moses didn't stay there forever. So just like they appeared, they also disappeared. Why? Because they didn't manifest in the flesh. They manifested in those spiritual, celestial bodies. And that's what Yahweh Shai had changed into. So just like it said, there appeared unto them Elias and Moses. They appeared, but then they disappeared. That's the same case with Yahweh Shai in Luke 4 and 28 when it tell you that the people is filled with wrath. 29, they rushed him. In verse 30, it say he passed through the midst of them. He disappeared on them. He disappeared. Now we're going to move on to the book of Isaiah 59 and 19. And why is that such an important miracle, that the Lord transfigured? What relevance, does that have today? How does that apply to us? So when we come to Isaiah 59 and 19, which is end time prophecy, it says, so shall they fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. When the enemy shall come in like a flood. The enemy is going to come in like a flood. Esau, Edom, the white man, the other nations, U.S. military, UN troops, military police, armed militias, they're going to come up against those who fear the Lord, who resist this new world order. They're going to come in like a flood, and they already doing it. With their ICE agents, they claim to be looking for illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants. That's them coming in, like a flood, just on a small level. It's gonna grow into them coming full force. But again, the enemy's gonna come in like a flood. To what? To deport us, throw us in Guantanamo Bay, ship us to El Salvador, throw us in the FEMA death camps to start exterminating us. But let's jump here real quick. We're going to come to the book of 2 Maccabees, chapter 15, verse 7. But Maccabees had ever short confidence that the Lord will help him. We should have that same faith. Wherefore he exhorted his people not to fear the coming of the heathen against them. So what was going on back then? The enemy came in like a flood. against those who feared the Lord and kept his commandments, just as they about to do here in this lifetime. So he exhorted his people not to fear the coming of the heathen against them, but to remember the help which in former times they had received from heaven. So when all hope seems lost, when escape is impossible by earthly means, remember the help from heaven. Remember the miracles. Whether it's the sword coming, the enemy coming, or you in the middle of a famine, or you sick with the pestilence, remember the help from heaven. Remember the help which in former times they had received from heaven. So remember how Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai delivered our forefathers. And now to expect the victory and aid which should come unto them from the Almighty. So when the enemy come in like a flood, the UN troops, military police, killer drones, killer robots, mechanical dogs, all of their weaponry, expect that help to come from heaven, expect to get the victory, over Esau, Edom, over this system. If you've been serving the Lord with all your heart, expect to get the victory, expect that help to get activated. So we see the Lord is going to intervene. So back to Isaiah 59:19. So shall they fear the name of the Lord from the west, here in America, and his glory from the rising of the sun. When the enemy shall come in like a flood. See that? The enemy is going to come in like a flood. It says what? The Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him. What's the Lord lifting up that standard? That's that help coming from heaven. Now something I want to deal with. Let me see. So the Spirit of the Lord is going to lift up a standard. Let's look at this in Hebrew and see what that means.
Strong's H 5127. Noose. Strong's H 5127. Noose.
So the Spirit of the Lord is going to lift up a standard. In other words, that help is going to come from heaven. The Lord is going to intervene. Now, this phrase in English, lift up a standard, in the Hebrew, it's a word noose. And noose means to flee or escape. So when the enemy come in like a flood, the Lord is going to make a way for us to escape. As you go down in the definitions, it says to take flight. So some people might start flying. The Lord might give people, the Lord will give people, certain of his people the ability to take flight. Or they may be teleported, by a chariot to safety. It says to depart. It says to disappear. So when the enemy come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him. Well, that help coming from heaven may just cause you to disappear before your enemy. Ain't that what Yahweh Shai did? So back to the book of Luke chapter 4, verse 28. When Yahweh Shai was speaking, the people was filled with wrath. The people rose up to try to push him over the cliff. But it tells you in verse 30, but he passing through the midst of them went his way. Now Yahweh Shai was completely surrounded, outnumbered, and we sure that it was no way for him to escape by any physical means. But it says he passing through the midst of them. So what did Yahweh Shai do? He transfigured. And because he transfigured or changed his form, he disappeared on them. They couldn't see him. And if case somebody may say we reaching too far. Okay, let's say if they could see him, they couldn't touch him. Because he transfigured or changed form, into a spiritual body. Just like when we come back to the book of Mark, chapter 9, in verse 2, when it tells you that he transfigured before them. So when he transfigures, physically, he's not there in the physical sense, meaning you can't touch him, etc. But he is there, uh, just in a higher form, in the spiritual, he's there spiritually. And it goes on to say, he was glowing, but it goes on to say, there appeared unto them Elijah and Moses. So even Elijah and Moses, they appeared in their transfigured state, which they didn't stay. Just like they appeared, they disappeared. Why? Because they were transfigured. They wasn't there in a physical sense and in the fleshly body, but they were there in the spirit, in the spiritual body. So they can choose to disappear, or you can see them, but you can't touch them. But again, Isaiah 59:19, when the enemy shall come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him, meaning a way to escape. And again, people are going to escape by taking flight. They're going to be teleported. They're going to just float away. Hey, some of us the Lord going to give us the ability to transfigure, and we're going to disappear. The enemy physically won't be able to see us. But Esau got heat-seeking technology. This nigga got all kind of cameras and gadgets, and he got different ways of detecting a presence. Even if you hide it behind something, he has a way to detect you. So if we disappear from the physical eye, it's a good chance Esau got something that can detect us. But again, not only will they not be able to see us, they're not going to be able to touch us. That's how Yahweh Shai passed through the midst of the people. Physically, they couldn't touch him. So, we could disappear physically, not be seen, or we could still be seen by the enemy, but we're going to transfigure so we won't be here physically. We won't exist in physical form. So they see us, but we'll be in spiritual form, and they won't be able to touch us. Whether they can see us or not, they won't be able to touch us. And that's how Elijah and Moses existed. It wasn't physical form, it was spiritual form. Yahweh Shai, we transfigured, that was spiritual form. And when you go to the word transfigure, it says what? To transform into something more beautiful or elevated. They elevated to the spirit, to spiritual form. It goes on to say to attack. Brother's going to be like Samson. To drive hastily, to cause to disappear. So the Lord is going to cause us, to transfigure. And with that transfiguration, we can physically disappear, not be seen. Or again, we could be seen, but we be in spiritual form, so the enemy can't touch us. So, Esau gonna come out against us to destroy us, but on his part, it's gonna be a failed mission. Whatever they imagine against the elect is gonna be a failed mission. Now, this is the book of Ecclesiastes 1-10. It says, is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? So when they see the elect, that help coming from heaven, that standard being lifted, and that standard being lifted can take place by the Lord causing us to disappear, that's going to be new to the people. They're going to be confounded. They've never seen nothing like it. Esau got cloaking technology to make them to appear invisible, but it has limitations. They may you know, may appear to be invisible to the naked eye, but you can bet you can still touch them. And if you can still touch them, that means they can be killed. But see, when the Lord calls us to disappear, um, we not going to be there in the physical sense. And Esau can't touch the spirit. And even if they do see us, we can still be there in spiritual form, can still see us, but Esau can't touch the spirit. So he's not going to be able to touch us. You know, Esau spent all that money, all that research, all them resources into trying to hide himself, but he could still be touched. He could still be killed. But yet, these miracles gonna be happening before the people. They like them people like just disappeared, or they there, but they like a hologram. They there, but you can't touch them. And what the question say, is this new? And the scriptures say it had been already of old time. So when people start disappearing or transfiguring into spiritual forms, no longer confined to the physical body, people gonna think it's a new thing. It's a new thing to this lifetime, but it's not new in the earth. You know, Yahweh Shai, and probably other times that's not mentioned in the Bible, the Lord calls our forefathers to transfigure. Well, really, even with the fiery furnace, with Hananiah, Azariah, and I think Mishael, when they threw in that fiery furnace, the Lord, that's why they wasn't burnt. The Lord caused them to transfigure. You could see them, they was there, but not in physical form. That's why I tell you, the fire didn't touch them. They didn't even smell like fire. They was in the furnace, but they were transfigured. Might have to do another lesson on that. Is there anything of where it may be said, see, this is new? It had been already of old time, which is before us. So our people been disappearing, transfiguring, transforming into spiritual forms. You see that in a lot of, fiction, what they will call them. Dragon Ball Z, other anime, they transfigure or transform. Our people been doing that. And guess what? They about to do it again on a whole nother level. And that's going to be happening before we get the new bodies. So yeah, this, remember the help from heaven, number 33, he was transfigured. Hey, the Lord going to cause us to change form or transform so that we may escape whatever's coming our way. So, hey, that's another thing to pray for. Lord, can you cause me to transfigure? Can you cause me to disappear? Can you change me to another form just so I can escape? And who else gonna think to pray for that? Nobody outside of those who got the understanding of the scriptures is going to think to even pray for that. But that's why the scriptures say the things written the fourth time was written for our learning to give us hope. So because of the understanding of the scriptures, we understand transfiguration. And we understand what it's for. It's not to stunt. It's not to look cool. It's not to do pranks. But it's to be delivered. It's to be delivered. Imagine the enemy closing in, then you turn invisible. Or imagine Esau open firing on you. Automatic bullets, throwing bombs at you. But you transfigure into a spiritual body. You no longer in the physical body, but a spiritual body, and you escape. Or whatever else Esau tried to do. In the FEMA death camp, and you transfigure to escape the FEMA death camp. And I did a dream lesson on that a couple years back. I was in the FEMA death camp, and the Lord caused me to turn invisible. And I walked right up out of there. That's going to be happening for brothers and sisters that fear the Lord. In other words, his elect. So, Lord willing, that was informative. Till next time, Shalom.